Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and this is going to be part 4A of a series of videos where we are doing a deep dive on evaluating the market structures within theory of the firm, comparing and contrasting perfect competition with monopolistic competition with monopoly, oligopoly, and we're trying to demonstrate our knowledge by pulling in past knowledge within microeconomics. So in this series, and again, this will be part of a few playlists, and I'll have these linked below. In this particular playlist dedicated towards monopolies and oligopolies, we have this series, and it kind of originally starts off with going over the price quantity variations between perfect competition versus monopoly. We have 1, 2, 3 here. And in this series, we're focusing on applying other evaluative points. So this is part 1, 2, 3, and this is going to be part 4A. And what are we covering exactly in this series? We can see it right here. Okay. All right. So in part A, we looked at allocative and productive efficiency and the differences between these market structures. This is the workings over here at the top, where we were highlighting some of these differences in graph A and graph B for perfect competition, in the firm. We looked at how perfect competition is allocatively efficient, both in the firm and the industry, and for the firm, productively efficient in the long run. Whereas in monopoly and monopolistic competition, we see that it's allocatively and productively inefficient. And then we also discussed how does that impact consumer and producer surplus relative to the other market structures. In part 2, which will also be linked in the video notes below, we focus particularly on price elasticity of demand, highlighting how in the industry you have a very inelastic demand curve. The firm faces a perfectly elastic demand curve, similar to monopolistic competition that has an elastic demand curve, where there is a negative relationship between price and total revenue. That's already covered. I'm just kind of reviewing that quickly. But if PED is greater than 1, if it's elastic, if price goes up, total revenue goes down, or if price goes down, total revenue goes up. So we're highlighting that in monopolistic competition and in perfect competition with the firm, there's the incentive to drive price down, to increase revenue, to become the cheaper alternative. Whereas for the monopoly, because PED is inelastic, there's a direct relationship between price and total revenue, and that creates the incentive for monopolies and oligopolies to raise price to gain more revenue. And then in part 3, the last video, which is also linked in the video notes below, we looked at monopolies and oligopolies in particular, and looked at what are the benefits of these firms sustaining supernormal profits. So there we looked at their ability to invest in research and development and how that can spill over positively to society as a positive production externality, as well as their ability to invest and achieve economies of scale. So that's already been covered. In this video, we're going to go over this component. We're going to balance part 3 with part 4, again looking at monopolies and oligopolies. In part 3, we're looking at the advantages of sustaining supernormal profit for monopolies and oligopolies. And here, we're going to look at the negative aspect of monopolies and oligopolies. So part 4A is going to focus on asymmetric information. So we're going to cover that now, versus symmetric information. And then part 4B, which I will add, is going to look at negative production within monopolies and oligopolies. So look out for those videos. And so let's go ahead and dig into this. Okay, so let's go into looking at monopolies and oligopolies. So we're looking at graph C. And we've already discussed in previous videos how when they profit maximize at quantity monopoly, they are underallocating resources. At QM, MB is greater than MC. There's an underallocation of resources. So we're not meeting the needs and wants in society. We're not producing the quantity desired by society. And because of the inelasticity of its demand curve, monopolies and oligopolies can raise price to increase total revenue, which reduces consumer surplus. So we've already discussed this. And we've already discussed how generating abnormal profit, which to highlight is here in this rectangular area. And maybe I'll color code that Here we have abnormal profit, and maybe I'll color code that in green. We talked about in the last video how monopolies and oligopolies that are able to sustain their supernormal profit can invest in research and development and economies of scale, and that can lead to positive production externalities. Pharmaceutical companies can come up with new effective medicines, vaccines, and so forth. And Amazon, as an example, as it achieves economies of scale, or a natural monopoly that achieves economies of scale, can reduce costs on average, and that leads to reductions in price and maximizes consumer surplus. To balance that, the positive with the negative, we're going to now look at asymmetric information, okay, versus symmetric information. So if you haven't done so on your paper exam, you want to define what that is. Asymmetric information is essentially when one party in a transaction knows more than the other. They have more information about the good or service or resource than the other party, and they're able to exploit that advantage in that transaction. We can assume that in perfect competition, there is symmetric information. Information is equally shared and accessible to both parties. However, for monopolies, that is not the case. So when we look at monopolies, oligopolies, and even in monopolistic competition to a degree, there is asymmetric information. Okay, I'm going to just highlight that. There's asymmetric information. And so that gives, in this case, the firm the ability to abuse that power. The classic example is perhaps a used car salesman intentionally selling defective vehicles that are unsafe for the road, to society, to consumers, and so forth. If you buy a used car, the used car salesman knows more about the defects than the potential buyer, as an example of asymmetric information. So let's look at our first point. Firms in monopoly, oligopoly, potentially monopolistic competition, abusing their asymmetric information against, in this case, the consumer. One example of that, and I have a video dedicated to that, is Boeing, which is part of a commercial aircraft duopoly with Airbus in Europe. And Boeing in the United States is a monopoly. They're the only commercial airline manufacturer. They have a near monopoly in certain markets like the US, and in the global market, it's duopolistic. And in this video that I created, that's going to be also linked below, we saw how Boeing had more knowledge than regulators and airlines that use these aircraft about the safety risks of the 737 MAX aircraft, specifically the MCAS software system. Knowing this, regardless, Boeing sold those defective planes, and thus that's an abuse of their power. Despite knowing about these defects, the company continued selling aircraft without the full disclosure to consumers or regulators. Who's consuming? The airline industry. American Airlines, Iberia Airlines, British Airways, Qatar Airways, etc., if they buy Boeing. And then what is the impact of that? Well, this is, the worst. You had two fatal crashes, Lion Air in 2018, Ethiopian Air in 2019, where 346 people were killed. So this is a real-world example that you can bring into your paper exam. So that's a clear case of abuse of power against the consumer in this case, due to the asymmetries of information. How would we illustrate asymmetric information? Here is a video that I have. Again, it's going to be linked in the video notes below, where we did a deep dive into this. So on the left, graph A, we have Boeing as a monopoly, seeking to reduce their costs on average, which will also reduce their supply curve by cutting corners, cutting on safety standards for their aircraft. And then they knowingly sell these aircraft. And so in graph C, we have an illustration of asymmetric information. We can have price and quantity on the X and Y axis, the upward sloping supply curve S1 equal to the marginal social cost, and their initial demand curve of D1 equal to the marginal private benefit, and we're going to make a label here with asymmetric information. So you had airlines demanding the defective Boeing 737 MAX due to a lack of knowledge of its defective nature. And so when D1 equals S1, we can see that at that free market quantity of QM, the marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit, and that is an overallocation of resources towards these defective aircraft that can harm society and lead to death in the case of 2 airline crashes. If society had information, if we were more aware of the defectiveness, then naturally consumers would reduce their demand. So a D2 equal to marginal social benefit with symmetric information, we would have D2 equal to S1, and that would be an allocatively socially optimal level of consumption. Okay, so that's where we should be with these planes. We should be aware of its defective nature so that we're not consuming them. That would lead to reduced demand. But since Boeing knowingly sold these planes, you can see how the demand rose to D1, generating an additional level of producer surplus for Boeing. So you have this video, it'll be linked in the video notes below, and you can follow this example and practice graphing an example of asymmetric information in the case of Boeing as a monopoly abusing its power. Are there other real-world examples that we can use illustrating the same model of asymmetric information? Yes, there are. And when I have time, I'll create dedicated videos to each of these examples. Again, putting monopoly and linking it to an asymmetric model. One example here is Volkswagen, the automotive manufacturer. It's kind of operating as oligopolistic, a degree of monopolistic competition, and they abuse their asymmetric information. VW installed defeat devices to cheat emission tests, making cars appear cleaner than they actually were, thus abusing their power. The consumer unknowingly is buying these cars that's doing this. Consumers believe that they were buying environmentally friendly cars, when in reality emissions were up to 40 times higher than the legal limits. The impact? Well, it's going to severely impact human health costs, pollution, urban pollution. Consumers were deceived. Legal fines exceeding 30 billion were then applied against Volkswagen by the EU. Another example, real world, that we can talk about. Again, using the same model of monopoly and linking it to an asymmetric information model like you just saw. We can talk about pharmaceutical companies. Another real world example. Pharmaceutical companies are oligopolistic, and here we have the example of Purdue Pharma that created a drug called OxyContin, sold in the US. And here there's asymmetric information because they downplayed the addictive risks of the opioids, based off of opioids, to doctors and to patients, thus abusing their market power, not providing enough information to the consumer, and aggressively marketing these opioids as safe, while knowing that there was a high risk of addiction. And that led to the US opioid crisis, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths, addiction, and severe impacts to families that are dealing with people who have these addictions. Another example, real world. Let's look at tech monopolies. Let's look at Facebook. All right, so let's highlight this. Tech monopolies like Facebook or Meta, even Google. Using their asymmetric information, users are unaware of the full extent of data collection by them, the privacy trade-offs that their users are providing private information, thinking that it will not be sold to a third party when indeed it is, manipulation of news feeds by Google, also abusing their power. And then we discovered that these firms were selling personal data to advertisers that consumers were not aware of, asymmetric information, or failing to disclose how algorithms shape user behavior to get them to be a little bit more addictive to it, and so on. So here we have the exploitation of consumer data, misinformation being also the platform being a vehicle for misinformation, and reducing overall social welfare, consumer welfare, and so on. So these are all real-world examples that you can bring in to discuss monopolies and the negative aspect of monopolies due to the fact that they don't experience severe competition that gives them market power to then abuse society through pricing, through asymmetric information, through providing defective goods to society, addictive goods to society, and so on. Okay, so that's part 4A of this series. And part 4B, the next one, we'll look at monopoly and use a monopoly model and then connect it to negative production, examples of monopolies engaging in negative production externalities. All of this part of an evaluation. Okay, if you have any questions, you can comment those questions below, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.